What happens when money can buy everything except peace for two broken children? Thomas Harrington was a man of stature and wealth, yet his grand estate was haunted by silence. 14 nannies had come and gone, each defeated by the storm of his restless twin boys. Nothing worked. No amount of discipline, therapy, or privilege could quiet their cries at night. Until one woman arrived. Her name was Grace Ellison. She wasn't polished, wasn't credentialed in the way society demanded, but she carried something rarer, patience forged in hardship, a strength that spoke in whispers rather than commands. And against all odds, she reached the boys in a way no one else could. But what happens when the very man who needs her most drives her away in a moment of pride? What scars does a family reveal when courts, gossip, and grief come crashing against the fragile beginnings of healing? And can a woman who has lost so much dare to accept love, not only from the children who call her mom, but from a man learning to stand beside her rather than above her? Stay with us to find out. Like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. And let's step into this unforgettable journey together. The rain came down in sheets that evening, hammering against the tall windows of the Harrington estate like an uninvited guest refusing to leave. Vermont's autumn storms were usually gentle, almost musical, but this one carried weight of restlessness that mirrored the turmoil inside the house. Thomas Harrington pushed open the heavy oak door of the master bedroom, his polished shoes striking the hardwood floor. He was drenched from his late return, his gray wool coat dripping in uneven trails across the rug. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, and his voice cracked through the stillness like lightning splitting a tree. "What the hell do you think you're doing in my bed?" The words weren't calm questions. They were accusations, sharp and hot, pulled from a man who had been living with rage too long. His dark eyes locked on the woman, startled awake beneath the quilt. Grace Ellison bolted upright, her hand instinctively reaching for the children beside her. Daniel, his thumb slipping from his mouth, stirred but didn't wake. David's tiny fist clutched the hem of Grace's cardigan as he let out a small sigh, rolling closer into her side. Both boys had been fighting sleep for months, plagued by nightmares, panic, and long silences that could stretch into hours. But tonight, in her presence, they had finally drifted into rest. Grace's heart thudded so loudly she was afraid it would wake them. Her voice came quiet, measured, the way she used to calm frightened students back when she taught. "Mr. Harrington, I can explain. Please don't wake them." But Thomas wasn't listening. His grief had sharpened into suspicion, and suspicion into fury. The sight of a stranger, a hired nanny, a woman he barely knew, lying between his twin sons, felt like a violation, a trespass he couldn't allow. The shadows of his late wife's memory clung to this room, and to see another woman in the bed, no matter the reason, ignited something dangerous in him. He crossed the room in long, angry strides. His palm came down fast, striking Grace across the cheek with a crack that echoed off the paneled walls. The sting burned hot against her skin, but she didn't cry out. She pressed a hand to her face, steadying herself, her eyes locking with his, not with anger, not even with fear, but with a quiet, stunned disbelief. "I don't care what excuse you think you have," Thomas growled. His voice was low, broken, his throat raw from whiskey and sleepless nights. "You're fired. Get out of my house. Now." Grace's lips parted, but she didn't argue. There were no words sharp enough to cut through a wall of grief and anger as thick as his. Instead, she looked down at the boys. Their small chests rose and fell in even rhythm, safe in slumber. For the first time since she'd arrived, they looked like ordinary children instead of wounded fragments. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper more to herself than to him. "They begged me not to leave them." They were finally calm. Thomas's jaw tightened. "I said, get out." Grace leaned forward, brushing a soft kiss over Daniel's forehead, then over David's. The touch lingered for a breath, as if she were leaving behind a promise she couldn't speak aloud. Then she slipped her shoes into her hand, stood tall, and walked past Thomas without another word. Her steps were light but steady, her back straight as she descended the grand staircase. Helen Brooks, the housekeeper who had served the Harrington family for decades, stood frozen at the foot of the stairs. Her eyes widened at the red mark blossoming across Grace's cheek. Grace met her gaze briefly, offering no explanation, only silence. She pulled her coat tighter and stepped into the storm. Outside, the rain had softened into a cold drizzle, misting the gravel driveway and glistening against the iron gate. Grace walked without haste, her figure disappearing into the fog, leaving behind the echo of something unspoken. She didn't look back. She never did. Upstairs, Thomas stood still, his breath ragged. The room was too quiet. He turned toward the bed, and for the first time he noticed it, the absence of thrashing, of muffled cries, of sweaty little hands clutching sheets. The boys lay still, their faces relaxed, their breathing soft as if they were safe. He swallowed hard. 14 nannies, endless therapists, countless doctors, none of them had managed to soothe the twins. And yet, this quiet woman, this stranger with calm eyes and soft voice, had done it. And he had struck her. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling, head lowered as shame seeped into his chest like spilled ink. He looked at his palms, one of them still tingling with the memory of the slap. The reflection staring back at him in the mirror was not the man he wanted to be, not the man his late wife had married, not the father his sons needed. On the nightstand lay a folded piece of paper, forgotten in his anger. He picked it up with unsteady fingers and opened it. The handwriting was careful, slightly curved. If you can't stay for them, at least don't chase away those who will. Thomas read it twice, then again. His chest constricted as if the words had slipped past his armor and struck something buried deep. Helen appeared quietly in the doorway, her face lined with years of service and sorrow. Her voice was steady but soft. "Sir." She didn't touch a thing in here. She only came in because Daniel had a nosebleed. The boys begged her to stay. Thomas didn't answer. He only stared at the note, his silence heavier than the storm outside. And for the first time in months, the Harrington house fell quiet, not with grief, not with rage, but with something else entirely, an unfinished piece, left behind by the woman he had just sent away. The Harrington estate had always been quiet, but this was different. It wasn't the dignified hush of wealth, the kind that lingered over long hallways and echoing staircases. No, this silence was raw, uneasy, like the aftermath of a slammed door. It pressed down on the walls, settled into the carpets, and hung in the air heavy enough to smother. Thomas sat at the end of the dining table the next morning, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling by his hand. The housekeeper, Helen Brooks, moved quietly around the kitchen, her steps deliberate, her hands steady, but even she couldn't mask the change. The absence of Grace Ellison lingered like a draft sneaking through a cracked window. The boys had woken late, something unusual for them. For months, they had risen in the early hours, calling out, trembling from night terrors that left them restless until dawn. But now, after just one night with Grace, they had slept straight through until nearly 8. Thomas should have been grateful, relieved even, but instead, the relief cut him with guilt. When Helen finally ushered the twins into the kitchen, Thomas looked up from his untouched breakfast. Daniel shuffled forward, rubbing his eyes, his small frame still wrapped in the softness of sleep. David clutched a stuffed rabbit by its ear, dragging it across the floor as he slid into his chair. Neither boy spoke. Their silence wasn't the usual sullen quiet of children who had been scolded or bribed into good behavior. It was deeper, sadder. Thomas cleared his throat, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Morning, boys." Daniel blinked at him, then turned his gaze toward his plate of toast. David squeezed the rabbit tighter, his lips pressed thin. They didn't answer. They rarely did, but today the refusal carried weight. Helen set a glass of orange juice in front of Daniel, her eyes flicking toward Thomas with unspoken reproach. She didn't need to say it. They noticed Grace's absence. Children always noticed. Thomas forced a bite of toast, though it turned dry in his mouth. His thoughts slipped back to the image of Grace, sitting cross-legged in the twins' bed, whispering soft stories that had lulled them into sleep. The memory cut sharply against his pride. He had been the one to build empires, to control boardrooms, to command respect with a single word. Yet, he couldn't calm his own sons. Grace had done in one evening what doctors and therapists had failed to achieve for months. He pressed his palm to his forehead, trying to banish the thought. Pride fought viciously with remorse. He told himself he'd been right to fire her, that boundaries had to be drawn, that strangers couldn't invade the sacred space of his late wife's memory. But another voice, softer yet relentless, asked, "Had you even tried to understand after breakfast?" Thomas retreated to his study. The storm from last night had left the grounds damp and shining, the gardens smelling of wet earth. Normally, that scent grounded him, reminded him of simpler summers when his wife, Catherine, would cut roses for the vases scattered through the house. Now, it only highlighted what was missing. The vases stood empty, the house held no laughter, and the silence, it was louder than ever. He pulled open a drawer, revealing the folded note Grace had left behind. The words stared at him again. "If you can't stay for them, at least don't chase away those who will." He had built his life on staying at his post when his business faltered, staying on his feet when grief clawed at him during the funeral, staying awake through endless nights of worry. But staying for the boys, that was harder. Their pain mirrored his own too closely. Their cries dragged him back into his own sleeplessness. And sometimes it was easier to bury himself in work than to face them. Grace had stayed quietly, unnoticed, without fanfare or complaint, and now, because of his pride, she was gone. A knock sounded at the study door. Helen's voice followed, low but insistent. "Sir, the boys are asking for her." Thomas froze. He had prepared for tantrums, for outbursts. But this was worse. It wasn't noise, but need. Their silence all morning had only been the prelude. What exactly did they say, he asked, his voice catching despite his attempt at control. Helen hesitated. Daniel asked if Miss Ellison would read to them again tonight. And David, he asked if she was coming back. Thomas stared at the fireless hearth. His chest tightened. The truth clawed at him. Undeniable now his sons had felt safer in the arms of a woman he had cast out, and the image of his hand striking her face steady. Resilient Grace gnawed at him until the shame burned hot in his throat. For the rest of the day, the silence grew thicker. The twins padded through the halls without laughter, their voices hushed. No one asked for cartoons. No one begged to go outside. They simply carried their toys from room to room, as if searching for her scent, her presence, in corners where she used to sit. That evening, Thomas tried reading to them himself. He picked up Goodnight Moon, the book Catherine used to favor. His deep voice stumbled over the sing-song rhythm, each line heavy where hers would have been light. Daniel stared at the ceiling, his face blank. David turned his back, clutching his rabbit tighter. When Thomas closed the book, neither child was asleep. Both stared with eyes wide open, waiting for someone who wasn't there. When they finally drifted off near midnight, Thomas remained seated in the rocking chair, staring at their small forms. He felt like an intruder in his own home, a stranger to his children, and a tyrant to the one woman who had managed to bring peace. The silence of the house pressed on him again as he left their room. This time, it wasn't the silence of grief. It was the silence of loss, his own doing. The note was small, almost careless in its presentation, but it carried the weight of a verdict. Thomas found it that evening, folded neatly on the nightstand beside the twins' bed, a scrap of lined paper, the kind torn from a notebook, written in plain handwriting without flourish. "If you can't stay, at least don't chase away those who will." 10 words. That was all. But they echoed louder than any argument, sharper than any accusation. He read them once, then again, until the letters blurred and the paper trembled in his grip. Thomas sat heavily on the edge of the bed, staring at his sons. Daniel lay curled on his side, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. David, always the lighter sleeper, stirred faintly but didn't wake. For the first time in months, both boys were resting peacefully. No tossing, no murmured cries, no frantic clinging to blankets, just sleep. It should have been a victory. But Thomas felt no triumph, only shame. The peace in their small faces was not his doing. It belonged to Grace. And he had struck her, humiliated her, cast her out as though she were disposable. He pressed a hand over his mouth, as though he could keep the regret from spilling out into words. He had built a life on controlling numbers, deals, reputations, but in the fragile space of his children's hearts, control had become a weapon. He had swung it recklessly, and it had landed on the one person who had managed to give them what they needed most. Down the hall, Helen moved quietly, folding laundry in the linen closet. She paused when she saw him sitting there, the note crumpled loosely in his fist. She didn't speak, but her gaze lingered. It was enough. She knew. "Did she say anything to you?" Thomas asked finally, his voice rough. Helen set down the folded sheet in her hands. Only that the boys begged her not to leave. That was why she stayed so long. Nothing else. Thomas closed his eyes. The memory of last night replayed the boys clinging to her, the quiet way she had kissed their foreheads before walking out. No accusation, no defense, just leaving. And now, the silence she left behind stretched wider than ever. He looked at Daniel again, studying the small crease in his brow, the kind that had haunted the child's sleep for months. Tonight, it was gone. Grace had smoothed it away, not with medicine or lectures, but with patience, with presence, Thomas whispered. Though the boys couldn't hear, "She gave you what I couldn't." The words tore at him. For all his wealth, his resources, his careful arrangements of tutors and specialists, none had reached his sons. A young woman with nothing but gentle persistence had done it in a single night. The note's words burned again in his mind. Don't chase away those who will. He had chased her, driven her out with his pride and his anger, convinced that his authority was more important than her compassion. In doing so, he had closed the door not only on her, but on the chance of healing for his boys. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He wandered the halls, the old floors creaking under his weight. The portraits of stern ancestors stared down at him from the walls, their painted eyes a gallery of silent judgment. He retreated to his study, poured himself a glass of scotch, and left it untouched on the desk. The amber liquid caught the lamplight, glowing like a flame he couldn't bring himself to swallow. Instead, he opened the drawer again, laid the note flat before him, and smoothed its creases. His hands trembled. He had struck her. The memory replayed with merciless clarity the crack of skin against skin, her staggered breath, the stunned silence in her eyes. He had never thought himself capable of such cruelty. Yet, in his grief, in his blindness, he had crossed a line he could never uncross. The house felt like a mausoleum now. The walls, once filled with Catherine's laughter and the boys' squeals, now absorbed nothing but silence. Grace had brought a glimmer of warmth back into it, however brief, and he had extinguished it. In the early hours of morning, Thomas drifted into the nursery again. David had kicked his blanket aside. Thomas bent down, tucking it gently around his son. The boy murmured in his sleep, a half-formed word. Thomas leaned closer, straining to hear. Gracie? The name was soft, almost inaudible, but it struck him like a blow to the chest. His son's first word in days, and it wasn't Daddy. It was hers. Thomas staggered back into the hallway, his chest tight. Pride could no longer shield him. The truth was undeniable. He had lost more than just a nanny that night. He had lost the only bridge his sons had dared to cross back into the world. By dawn, the estate grounds glistened with dew. Thomas stood by the window, his reflection pale against the glass. He looked at himself, the broad shoulders, the strong jaw, the polished image of a man who had conquered the world. Yet behind the reflection stood a stranger, a father who had failed, a man who had raised his hand against kindness. The note lay in his pocket. He didn't need to read it again. Its words had carved themselves into his heart. He whispered into the quiet house, more to himself than anyone else I may have just destroyed the only chance they had. The silence answered back, and in it, Thomas Harrington finally felt what it meant to be powerless. The bus station in Brattleboro, Vermont, was hardly more than a drafty building with a few benches and a flickering overhead light. Outside, the late autumn air bit hard against the skin, sharp with the promise of an early snow. Grace Ellison pulled her coat tighter and sat on the cold wooden bench, her worn canvas bag resting at her feet. In her hand, a ticket to Savannah. South warmth, distance, escape. She traced the edge of the paper with her thumb as though its corners could anchor her. Around her, the station hummed faintly with vending machines, the shuffle of boots, and the occasional cough of travelers heading elsewhere. Yet she felt entirely alone, as though the world had shrunk to this bench and the ache in her chest. She hadn't cried when Thomas raised his hand. She hadn't cried when she walked past the estate's iron gates into the rain. But here, beneath the pale fluorescent lights of a half-forgotten station, tears welled unbidden. She wiped them quickly, an old habit born from years of swallowing grief in public places. Grace leaned back, letting her head rest against the wall, and for the first time allowed herself to drift into memory. Her childhood had not been one of soft beds or bedtime stories. She grew up in a trailer on the edge of town, the kind of place where winters meant stuffing towels into window cracks and summers meant listening to the hum of a broken fan. Her father was a mechanic with calloused hands and a stubborn streak. Her mother, a waitress who worked double shifts but still counted pennies at the kitchen table. Grace learned early that security was something other people had. When she was 12, she took her first babysitting job 3 kids down the road, rambunctious and wild. She remembered sitting on the porch steps, braiding one girl's hair under the setting sun, while the boys ran barefoot through the grass. For a moment, she had felt powerful, needed. Maybe that was when she first knew children were her safe place, even when life wasn't. Later, against all odds, she made it to college. She studied education, driven by the belief that she could give children the stability she never had. She became a teacher, standing in front of classrooms filled with restless faces and wondering eyes. She loved it, the chalk dust, the clatter of pencils, the spark in a child's gaze when they finally understood something hard. But the job didn't last. Her father grew ill. His lungs betrayed him, years of engine fumes catching up at last. Grace left her teaching post without hesitation, moving back into the cramped trailer to care for him. She became nurse, cook, provider, watching the man who had once been larger than life shrink before her eyes. It was during those years that she lost something even greater. The memory of her baby returned uninvited, as it always did in quiet moments. She had been 23, young and hopeful, clutching a tiny onesie at her baby shower. She remembered tracing the edges of its fabric, imagining the little body that would fill it. But the joy was short-lived. Complications came swiftly, cruelly, and she left the hospital with empty arms. Grief had no map. It came in waves sometimes, a tide that pulled her under, other times a dull ache that lingered like a bruise. She buried the onesie in the bottom drawer of a dresser she no longer owned, but she never buried the longing. That loss had shaped her. It made her softer, more patient with the children she cared for, but also more guarded with her own heart. When she held Daniel and David, she felt echoes of what might have been 2 fragile lives leaning into her presence, trusting her to keep the shadows at bay. Perhaps that was why she stayed long after she should have left. Perhaps that was why leaving now hurt more than the sting on her cheek. A woman sat down on the bench across from her, clutching a styrofoam cup of coffee. She glanced at Grace's damp eyes but said nothing, only slid a crumpled tissue from her purse and offered it across the space between them. Grace managed a small smile, whispered, "Thank you," and took it. The gesture, small as it was, reminded her that kindness still survived in unlikely corners. The station loudspeaker crackled, announcing the southbound bus's arrival. Grace tucked the ticket into her pocket, her hand trembling. The thought of leaving Vermont should have brought relief. Distance meant safety, yet, as the headlights of the bus cut through the foggy window, her chest tightened, her feet felt heavy, unwilling to rise, because even though she had told herself she was walking away from pain, she knew she was also walking away from the boys, those wide eyes, those trembling voices calling her name in the night. They had trusted her, and she was abandoning them, not by choice, but by the jagged force of pride and misunderstanding. She closed her eyes as the bus hissed to a stop outside. She could almost hear David's small voice again, whispering Gracie into the dark. The driver's call echoed Savannah. Boarding, now Grace stood slowly, wrapping her coat tighter. She picked up her canvas bag, feeling its weight heavier than usual, as though it carried not just clothes, but the sum of her choices. She stepped toward the platform, but then paused. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft flakes catching in the station's dim lights. The world seemed to hush under its blanket, and for a moment, Grace felt the old ache of her baby's absence mingle with the new ache of leaving the twins. Her life had been full of leaving forced, necessary, inevitable, but in her heart, she longed for something that stayed. With trembling hands, she slipped the ticket back into her pocket. She wasn't ready. Not yet. The drive out of the estate was longer than usual that morning, though Thomas hardly noticed the frost on the meadows or the mist clinging to the tree line. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles pale. On the passenger seat lay a folder, the one Helen had pressed into his hand after their strained conversation the night before. Inside, Grace Ellison's file, with its neat handwriting and a return address, a small duplex in a working-class neighborhood on the edge of town. Thomas had debated with himself all night. Pride had told him to let it go, to tell himself she was just another caretaker who had come and gone. But each time he saw the boys' hollow eyes, the silence that filled their rooms, he knew better. They hadn't asked for tutors. They hadn't asked for doctors. They had asked for her. The duplex came into view, paint peeling from the siding, a bicycle left rusting against the porch. It looked nothing like the grandeur of Harrington Estate, yet Thomas's chest tightened as if he were about to enter a palace. He parked, stepped out into the brittle morning air, and forced himself up the walkway. Grace opened the door before he could knock. Her face was calm, too calm, the kind of composure that came after storms had already blown through. The faint mark on her cheek had faded, but the memory of his hand still lingered between them like a ghost. "Mr. Harrington," she said evenly, her tone neither warm nor cold, just distant. "Why are you here?" He removed his hat, fumbling for words. "I came to apologize, to ask you to come back." Grace's laugh was short, incredulous. She leaned against the doorframe, folding her arms. "Come back? After what you did? After the way you looked at me like I was trespassing in your life? I was wrong," Thomas admitted quickly, surprising even himself with the bluntness. "I let my anger speak louder than the truth, and I can't." He broke off, exhaling sharply. "The boys need you." Her eyes softened for just a flicker at the mention of the twins, but then steeled again. "And what about you? Do you need me, Mr. Harrington? Or do you just need someone to fix what you don't want to face?" The words struck home, sharper than any business rival's barb. He lowered his gaze, unable to answer right away. Before either could continue, footsteps approached. Helen Brooks appeared at the curb, her sturdy figure wrapped in a wool coat, her breath clouding in the morning air. She had insisted on coming, saying, "If you mean to face her, you won't do it alone. Not after what happened, Grace," Helen said gently, her voice carrying the weight of years. "You should know, she stayed that night only because the boys begged her to, not because of duty, not because of him." She glanced at Thomas. "Because they trusted her. That's all." Grace's throat worked as though she were swallowing back words. She looked at Thomas, eyes narrowing. "And you thought the right response to that was to strike me, to fire me in front of them." Thomas's shoulders sagged. He had faced investors ready to dismantle his company, rivals eager to see him ruined, but nothing had undone him like this woman's gaze. "I don't have an excuse," he said quietly. "I only have regret, and a plea that you don't let my failure become theirs." Grace shook her head, her hands tightening over her arms. "Do you think an apology wipes it away, that I can just walk back into your mansion, smile at your staff, and pretend it never happened? I don't expect it to be easy," Thomas replied, forcing steadiness into his voice. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I can't ignore the way they look for you, the way they sleep only when you're near. You've given them something I cannot." Her composure cracked, just for a second. A breath caught in her throat, her eyes glistening before she turned away. "You don't know what you're asking. Every time I stay, it costs me something. I've lost before. I've buried hope before. I can't risk that again." Helen stepped closer, her tone firm. "Grace, no one's asking you to save him. But those boys, they've already chosen you. And if you leave now, they'll learn the same lesson too early that people always go." The silence stretched. Grace's fingers tapped against the wooden frame of the door. She glanced past Thomas toward the street, as if weighing the distance between leaving and staying. Finally, she met his eyes again. "If I were to come back, it wouldn't be as a servant. I won't be invisible, spoken to only when convenient. If I return, it's for them, not for you." Thomas nodded quickly, relief surging through him, though he kept it measured. "For them, yes." Grace's expression softened, but only slightly. "Don't mistake my care for them as forgiveness for you. That will take longer if it comes at all." "I understand," Thomas said, his voice low, reverent, "but even hearing you say 'if' gives me more hope than I deserve." Helen laid a hand on Grace's arm. "Think about it, dear. Not for him, not even for yourself. For Daniel, for David." Grace exhaled, long and heavy, the kind of sigh that carried years of pain and weariness. "I'll think about it," she said at last, then closed the door gently but firmly. Thomas stood motionless on the porch, staring at the peeling paint. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't the no he had feared. As he turned back toward the car, Helen walked beside him, her silence steady but not unkind. "You see," she murmured, "you may have opened the door, but it's up to her whether she steps through it again." Thomas nodded, his chest tight. He knew she was right. For the first time in his life, control was not his to wield. And maybe, he thought as he slid behind the wheel, that was exactly the lesson he needed. It was 3 days before Grace sent word. Not a phone call, not a letter, just a short note slipped under the estate's front gate, the handwriting unmistakable. "I'll return tomorrow afternoon, but there will be conditions." Thomas read it 3 times, standing in the foyer with Helen watching him carefully. The old housekeeper's eyes betrayed a glimmer of relief, but also a silent warning, don't squander this chance. When the next afternoon came, the estate gates opened to admit a modest taxi. Grace stepped out, her canvas bag slung over her shoulder, her coat buttoned tight against the chill. She walked up the steps with quiet determination, not like an employee reporting for duty, but like someone entering a negotiation on equal ground. Thomas waited by the front door. He had rehearsed apologies, words of welcome, explanations, but the moment he saw her, every speech collapsed into silence. He simply opened the door wider and said, "Come in." Grace entered without hesitation, her gaze sweeping the familiar hallway. The boys' laughter echoed faintly from upstairs. They had been told she might return, and for the first time in days, they seemed lighter. Still, Grace did not smile. She turned to Thomas, her eyes steady. "Before I agree to stay," she said, "we need to set terms, non-negotiable ones." Thomas straightened, his pride instinctively bristling, but he forced himself to nod. "Go on." Grace set her bag down, folding her hands in front of her. "First family dinners, every night. The boys need to see you at that table, not just hear about you from the papers. No excuses, no sudden meetings. If you want them to believe they matter, you must sit with them, share bread with them, Look them in the eye. Thomas opened his mouth, a reflexive protest rising. His evenings were often consumed by calls, negotiations, obligations, but when he saw the firmness in her expression, he swallowed it back. He nodded once. Agreed, Grace continued, her tone calm but unyielding. Second, no cameras in their rooms. No watching them through lenses as if they're suspects in your house. Children don't heal when they're monitored like prisoners. They heal when they feel safe. This time, Thomas did bristle. Security had been his armor since Catherine's death. His way of controlling the uncontrollable. The cameras are for their protection, he began. Grace shook her head, cutting him off. No, they're for your fear. If you want me here, the cameras go. You can't parent from behind a screen. The words stung, but they were true. Thomas felt Helen's eyes on him, the weight of her unspoken agreement. He let out a long breath. Fine, the cameras go. Third, Grace said softly, we write a family charter. Not me alone, not you alone. Together with the boys. Simple rules, promises we all keep. No shouting, no leaving without goodbyes, no punishments born of anger. A home is not just walls, it's trust. And trust needs words we can all see. Thomas's jaw tightened. He had signed contracts worth millions, bound companies with clauses and signatures. Yet here she was, asking him to sign something infinitely harder, a promise to his children. Her gaze didn't waver. If you can't agree to these, then I walk away now. And this time, I don't come back. The silence between them stretched. Thomas's pride screamed against surrender, against allowing this woman to dictate terms in his house. But pride had kept him alone, and pride had left his sons adrift. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw not defiance, but resolve. She wasn't demanding power for herself. She was drawing boundaries for the boys. Finally. He nodded. His voice was low, rough, agreed, all of it. For the first time since she had stepped inside, Grace allowed the hint of a smile. It was small, fleeting, but it carried more weight than his fortune ever could. Then I'll stay, she said quietly. Upstairs. Daniel's voice rang out, high with excitement. She's back. David, she's back. Their footsteps thundered down the stairs, two small figures tumbling into the foyer. They collided with Grace, arms wrapping around her legs, faces buried against her coat. She bent down, gathering them close, her eyes closing for a brief moment as she let herself feel the warmth of their embrace. Thomas watched, his throat tight. He had been the one to beg her return, but it was the boys who celebrated her victory. He stood slightly apart, as though witnessing something sacred. Helen cleared her throat gently, breaking the silence. Well then, she said, her voice steady but warm. Shall I set the table for 4 tonight? Grace glanced up, her arms still around the boys. Yes, she answered, for 4. That evening, the Harrington dining room, so often a cavern of empty chairs, held life again. 4 plates, 4 glasses, 4 voices. Daniel chattered about the toy soldiers he had lined on the windowsill. David asked Grace if she would read the bedtime story. And Thomas, though still clumsy, tried to contribute, asking questions, listening more than speaking. The meal itself was simple roast chicken, mashed potatoes, steamed green beans, but it carried a weight that none of them missed. For the first time, the Harringtons were a family at the table, bound not by blood alone, but by choice. And though Thomas still felt the sting of surrender, he also felt something else, something he hadn't in a very long time. Hope. The Harrington estate had never smelled like home until now. For years, the kitchen had been kept immaculate, its marble counters gleaming, its copper pots polished to a shine. Meals were prepared by chefs, plated with precision, and carried out in silence. But in the weeks after Grace's return, the house began to take on a different rhythm. The scent of garlic sizzling in butter drifted down the hall. A pot bubbled gently on the stove while Daniel sat at the counter, his small hand sprinkling cheese over a tray of lasagna. David, perched on a stool, tapped a spoon against the bowl, creating an uneven rhythm that made Grace laugh. "You're supposed to stir, not drum," she teased, ruffling his hair. David grinned, the shadow that had once clouded his face lifting more each day. "But it sounds better this way." From the doorway, Thomas watched. He had just returned from a meeting in town, but instead of retreating to his study, he lingered. He saw his sons laughing, really laughing for the first time since Catherine's passing. It startled him, the sound both foreign and familiar, like music he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Grace caught his gaze and gestured toward the apron hanging on a hook. "If you're standing there, you might as well make yourself useful." For a moment, Thomas hesitated. He had never chopped an onion in his life, let alone cooked a meal from scratch. But the boys' eager faces turned toward him, and something in him yielded. He shrugged off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and tied the apron clumsily around his waist. The attempt was disastrous. His onion slices came out uneven, some thick as coins, others paper thin. He winced as the sting brought tears to his eyes, and Daniel giggled uncontrollably. "Daddy's crying." Thomas laughed despite himself, shaking his head. "These onions are vicious, that's all." Grace hid her smile behind her hand, though her heart swelled. She had seen men like Thomas, commanders of boardrooms, rulers of fortunes, reduced to helplessness by the simplest tasks of care. But here, in his fumbling, she saw sincerity. He was trying, and that mattered more than perfection. Evenings grew softer. After dinner, the four of them gathered in the sitting room, the fire casting warm light over the shelves. Grace read most nights, her voice steady, carrying the twins into dreams with stories of rabbits and faraway adventures. But one evening, Daniel tugged on Thomas's sleeve. "Daddy, you read?" The request froze him. His instinct was to deflect, to say he was too tired, too busy. But Grace's eyes met his gentle, encouraging, expectant. He cleared his throat, picked up the book, and began. The words came awkwardly, his deep voice stumbling over the lilting rhymes. His timing was off, his tone too flat. But the boys leaned in anyway, their eyes wide, their small bodies nestled against his sides. "Good night, stars. Good night, air." His voice cracked at the end, but the boys didn't notice. They were too wrapped up in the rare comfort of his presence. When he finished, David whispered, "Again?" Thomas glanced at Grace, almost embarrassed. She gave a small nod. And so, he read again, slower this time, letting the rhythm carry him. By the final page, Daniel's eyes had closed, his breathing even. David followed soon after, the stuffed rabbit slipping from his arms. Thomas closed the book quietly, his hands trembling as he placed it on the table. For the first time, he had been the one to bring them peace. Later that night, Grace stood by the window of her small room at the back of the house. She looked out at the garden, the frost glittering faintly in the moonlight. From downstairs came the muffled sound of Thomas closing a cabinet, preparing for bed. Her heart was warm. How could it not be? After the laughter in the kitchen, the sight of the twins safe in their father's arms, and yet, beneath the warmth lay a quiet caution. She had been here before, in other places, with other promises. Moments of safety had a way of shattering. She touched the windowsill lightly, grounding herself. She wasn't here for Thomas, no matter how earnestly he tried. She was here for Daniel and David, for the fragile smiles she had coaxed from them, for the nights she had turned their cries into dreams. Still, when she closed her eyes, she saw Thomas's face as he read, awkward but determined, and though she resisted it, a part of her couldn't help but wonder, maybe, just maybe, change was possible. The letter arrived in a thick white envelope embossed with the seal of the Vermont family court. Helen was the one who carried it in from the mailbox, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it on the dining table. Thomas saw it, his face tightening as though he had known this moment was inevitable. He slit the envelope open with a silver knife, unfolded the papers, and read silently. His jaw clenched. The room grew heavier with each line, his eyes devoured. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a growl. "They're filing for custody." Grace froze mid-step, the plate she had been carrying slipping from her hands onto the table with a dull clatter. "Who my wife's parents?" Thomas said, tossing the papers down. "The Whitmores. They claim I'm unfit, angry, volatile, incapable of raising the boys alone." He let out a bitter laugh. "They've hired a lawyer who specializes in tearing fathers apart." Grace reached for the papers, scanning quickly. Her chest tightened at the words, "history of violent outbursts, emotional instability, unsafe environment." She didn't need a mirror to know that, somewhere in the evidence, the memory of Thomas's hand striking her would be twisted into proof. "And me?" she asked quietly, though she already feared the answer. Thomas hesitated. His eyes flicked away, then back. "They've named you too. Said you're an unqualified outsider, that you've manipulated the boys' attachment, made them dependent on you." His fists tightened at his sides. "They're painting you as a fraud." Grace sank into a chair, the weight of the accusation pressing into her shoulders. A fraud. The word echoed in her mind, sharp and merciless. All she had done was sit beside two frightened children, hold them through their night terrors, coax laughter out of silence. And now, for that, she was being called dangerous. The days that followed carried attention the house hadn't known since Catherine's death. Lawyers called. Reporters sniffed around the gates. The Whitmore's accusation spread like whispers through town. Thomas Harrington was unraveling, and the nanny he kept under his roof was nothing more than a desperate woman chasing security. Grace felt the stares when she went to the market, the sidelong glances of neighbors who wondered what story she carried. She ignored them, but inside, a storm brewed. At night, she lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts circled endlessly. She had sworn to herself she wouldn't get entangled, that she would protect her heart. Yet here she was, caught in a battle that wasn't hers. Her name dragged into court documents as if she were the villain. "You could leave now," a voice whispered. "Pack your bag, walk away before it destroys you." She imagined it leaving the estate, disappearing south, letting the Whitmores take their case and their bitterness without her. It would be safer, easier. But then she saw Daniel's eyes in her mind, wide and pleading when he woke from nightmares. She heard David's quiet whisper in the dark, "Gracie, don't go." The memory pulled at her chest until it ached. One evening, she found herself in the garden after the boys had gone to bed. The air was crisp, the moonlight silver over the frost-tipped grass. Thomas joined her, his footsteps crunching softly. "They'll try to destroy me," he said simply. His voice held no bravado, no shield of pride, just weary truth. "And if they can't, they'll try to destroy you." Grace turned to face him, her breath visible in the cold air. "And what if they succeed? What if I'm painted as the unstable one? I've been poor. I've been desperate. I don't have letters after my name or money to fight them. To them, I'm just a nobody who clung to your sons." "You're not a nobody," Thomas said sharply, his eyes fierce. "You are the only reason my boys laugh again. The only reason they sleep." "That's not nothing. Grace, it's everything." His words warmed her, but fear lingered. And if the court believes otherwise, Thomas's silence was answer enough. The courts favored blood, money, appearances. He could not guarantee her safety from their judgment. That night, Grace sat at her desk and pulled out a notebook. She began writing. Page after page, memories of the boys, notes of their progress, the tiny victories she had witnessed, Daniel's first full night of sleep, David's soft humming while he colored, the way they had started to ask questions again, curious about the world. She wrote not for herself, but for them, for proof that love had planted something real in their lives. As she wrote, her hand trembled. Her heart asked the question she had been avoiding. Will you stand for them, even if it costs you everything? She closed the notebook, pressing her palm against its cover. The answer was already there, steady and undeniable. She had left once, and the house had drowned in silence. If she left again, what lesson would the boys learn? That love was fleeting, that promises always broke the following morning. Helen found her in the kitchen early. the notebook beside her teacup. "You didn't sleep," Helen said softly. "No," Grace admitted. Her eyes were tired, but her voice was steady. "But I've decided, if they call me to that stand, I'll speak, not for Thomas, for the boys." Helen laid a gentle hand over hers. "That's all that matters." Grace nodded, though inside, the fear still gnawed. She wasn't sure the court would hear her heart, but she knew Daniel and David would. And sometimes, that was enough. The courtroom smelled of polished oak and old paper, a place where lives were weighed in words and signatures. Grace sat at the long wooden table beside Thomas, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her notebook tucked inside her bag like a talisman. Across the aisle, the Whitmores sat rigid, their suits immaculate, their disdain unmasked. The judge, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes, called the session to order. Thomas's lawyer presented opening arguments, painting a portrait of a father, flawed but fighting, of children fragile yet healing. Then came the Whitmores' attorney, a man with a voice like steel, polished and sharp. "Mrs. Whitmore believes her grandsons are in danger," he said. "She believes Mr. Harrington's household is unstable, and that his so-called caretaker," his gaze flicked toward Grace, "is not qualified to raise children, let alone children who have already endured trauma." Grace felt the words like stones hurled across the room. She kept her head high, but her stomach twisted. The first hours were a blur of testimony, neighbors speaking of Thomas's temper, former nannies recounting the boys' night terrors. The Whitmores spoke of Catherine, their daughter, painting her as a saint lost too soon, their grief wielded like a weapon. Finally, the lawyer said, "We call Grace Ellison to the stand." Grace rose. Her knees trembled, but her steps were steady. She swore the oath, then sat, the wooden chair cold against her back. The lawyer leaned forward, his smile thin. "Miss Ellison, is it true you have no degree in child psychology? No formal training?" "Yes," Grace said calmly. "And yet you presume to know what these boys need." She paused, breathing slowly. "I don't presume. I listen. They tell me in their way." The lawyer scoffed. "Listening is not a qualification." "Would you agree?" Grace lifted her chin. "Listening is the first qualification." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The questioning grew sharper. "Miss Ellison, did Mr. Harrington strike you in front of the children?" Her throat tightened. She had dreaded this moment. "Yes," she said softly. Gasps fluttered across the gallery. The lawyer's smile widened. "So the children witnessed violence in their own home." "They witnessed a mistake," Grace replied, her voice steadier now. She looked at the judge, and they witnessed something else. Remorse. Change. They saw a man admit he was wrong. That matters too. The lawyer frowned, thrown off balance. "You stayed after being struck." "No." Grace said, "I left. But the boys asked me to come back. Not because I am perfect, but because I stayed when others didn't. That is what children notice, not credentials, not bank accounts, not polished words. They notice who stays." The judge leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as if testing the weight of Grace's words. The lawyer tried again. "Miss Ellison, would you consider yourself family to these children?" Grace hesitated only for a moment. Then she said firmly, "Yes, but you are not related by blood." "No," she said. "Family is not always blood. Family is the person who sits beside you when you're crying at midnight. Family is the hand that doesn't let go when you're afraid. I am their family because I stayed." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she didn't look away. From the bench, the judge shifted her glasses. "Miss Ellison," she said gently, "tell me why you stayed." Grace drew in a long breath. Her hands shook slightly, but her eyes were steady. "Because when I first arrived, Daniel and David didn't laugh. They didn't sleep. They whispered only to each other, as if the world outside their bond was too dangerous. I stayed because one night Daniel cried until he fainted from exhaustion, and David begged me not to leave him. I stayed because I saw two little boys trying to survive a storm bigger than they could understand, and I knew I could not walk away. Silence blanketed the room. At the back of the courtroom, the twins sat with Helen. Their small suits looked too stiff, but their eyes never left Grace. Daniel's hands were clenched in his lap, David's head resting against Helen's arm. When Grace's gaze flicked to them, she saw it the trust, the quiet belief that she would not abandon them. Her chest swelled with both fear and strength. The lawyer tried one final time. Miss Ellison, don't you think professionals with degrees and licenses are better suited to care for children with such fragile needs? Grace met his stare. Children don't measure love in degrees. They don't count licenses. They count presence. They count who walks into the dark with them and doesn't turn away. And if you ask those boys who makes them feel safe, it won't be a stranger with a certificate. It will be me. When her testimony ended, Grace stepped down slowly. The courtroom was hushed, the air heavy with what had just been spoken. She passed by the twins' row. Daniel reached out quickly, brushing his fingers against hers before Helen pulled him gently back. It was a fleeting touch, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken. Grace returned to her seat beside Thomas, her heart pounding. He didn't speak, but his eyes dark, humbled, were fixed on her with something close to reverence. For the first time in weeks, Grace felt no doubt about her place. She had stood in the storm, and she had not broken. The courtroom was silent as Judge Templeton adjusted her glasses and looked down from the bench. Every face in the room leaned forward, breath caught in the pause. Grace felt her heart thudding like a drum in her chest, her hands cold against her knees. This court, the judge began, her voice steady, acknowledges the loss suffered by both families. It also recognizes the heavy responsibility of protecting the welfare of Daniel and David Harrington. She paused, scanning both sides of the aisle. After reviewing testimony, evidence, and the progress made in the children's care, the petition to remove custody from Mr. Thomas Harrington is denied. A collective breath released. The Whitmores stiffened in their seats, Eleanor clutching her pearls as though strangled by them, while James's lips thinned into a grim line. Thomas's lawyer nodded with quiet satisfaction, but Thomas himself simply bowed his head, his shoulders trembling once before he drew in a long breath. He had been spared, but he knew it was not his strength that saved him. Grace sat frozen, her eyes on the judge. No applause, no triumphant cheer filled the air, only relief, fragile, tentative, like glass that could shatter with a touch. Outside, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, microphones flashing toward Thomas as he emerged. He shielded his sons with one arm while Helen guided them toward the waiting car. Grace kept her head down, avoiding the cameras, her only thought on keeping the boys calm. Mr. Harrington, how do you respond to accusations of violence in the home? One reporter shouted. Thomas stopped for the briefest second. His jaw flexed. But instead of the anger Grace had feared, he said quietly, "We are a family, learning to heal. That is all." Then he moved forward, ushering his sons into the car. Grace slipped in last, pulling the door shut against the chaos. Inside, silence cocooned them. Daniel leaned against her shoulder, exhausted. David clutched her hand without a word. Thomas stared out the window as the car pulled away, his reflection stark against the glass. Back at the estate, the house felt strangely alive again, as if it had been holding its breath too. The twins raced inside, running down the hall toward the nursery with sudden bursts of laughter. Grace followed more slowly, her body heavy with the weight of the day. Thomas lingered in the foyer, staring up at the grand chandelier. His hands hung at his sides, empty yet restless. Grace watched him for a moment, then asked softly, "Are you all right?" He turned to her, and for the first time, his pride seemed stripped away. "I should be. I kept them, but it doesn't feel like winning. Grace, it feels like being given another chance I don't deserve." She stepped closer. Sometimes the best victories are the quiet ones, the ones that let you breathe again. His eyes met hers, searching, as though weighing the truth of her words. "I wouldn't have breathed at all without you," he said finally. Grace's throat tightened, but she said nothing. Words felt unnecessary. That evening, the family gathered for dinner in the kitchen, not the grand dining room with its long, cold table, but the smaller space where the smell of roasted chicken and warm bread softened the air. Grace set the plates while Thomas poured water. The twins sat side by side, chattering about how the courtroom chairs squeaked and how Daniel had counted the number of steps in the courthouse. For the first time in months, Thomas stayed at the table through the entire meal. He listened, really listened, even when the boys' stories meandered. At one point, David dropped his fork and leaned against Grace. Without hesitation, Thomas reached across the table and said, "Here, son, use mine." David's face lit up, surprised, as though such a simple gesture carried the weight of a miracle. Grace watched the exchange quietly. Something subtle was shifting. Later, after the boys had been tucked into bed, Grace found Thomas in the library. He sat by the fire, a glass of untouched scotch beside him. Papers lay on the desk, custody documents, court transcripts, reminders of the storm they had just endured. He gestured for her to sit. "I used to think of you as an employee," he said, his voice low, reflective, "someone I paid to fill a role. But today, watching you on that stand," his voice trailed off, heavy with meaning. Grace waited. "You weren't defending me," he continued. "You were defending them. And I realized I can't do this alone. Not as their father, not as a man, not anymore." Grace felt the weight of his words. For so long, she had been cautious, keeping a careful distance, guarding her heart. But here, in the soft glow of the fire, she saw something in Thomas she hadn't before, not the hard, prideful man who had slapped her in a moment of rage, but someone learning how to be human again. "You don't need to do it alone," she said quietly. His eyes met hers, tired but steady. "Then stay not as staff, but as a partner, not just for them, but with me." Grace's breath caught. She nodded slowly, not with certainty, but with a resolve born of love. "For them," she said, "always for them." The house felt different in the weeks after the court's decision. Relief had settled into its walls, but it wasn't enough to simply hold on to what they had. Grace sensed it in urgency, a tug in her chest. Healing was never meant to be contained behind gates. One evening, as the twins built block towers on the rug, Grace approached Thomas in the study. He was sorting through estate papers, his pen scratching steadily across documents. "Thomas," she began carefully, "what if this house wasn't only for us?" He looked up, brows knitting. "What do you mean, I mean? We've fought so hard to give Daniel and David a place where they can breathe, laugh, and heal. But there are other children, Thomas. Children like them, maybe worse off. What if part of this house became a sanctuary for them too?" His pen stilled for a long moment. He didn't speak. "Grace, this isn't a school. It's not a charity. It's our home." "I know," she said softly. "But sometimes a home can be both." The idea hung in the air for days. Thomas resisted at first. His instinct was to protect what little stability they had found. But every time he saw Grace with the twins patiently coaxing them through fears, teaching them new games, reminding them to hope, he wondered if she was right. One night, as he watched the boys sleep peacefully, Thomas felt a shift. They were healing. Yes. But what if their healing could multiply? What if the walls that had once trapped grief could instead shelter possibility? The next morning, he found Grace in the kitchen, stirring oatmeal. "We'll try it," he said quietly. She turned, surprise flashing in her eyes. "You mean it?" He nodded. "One room, one group. If it fails, it ends there." A smile bloomed across her face, soft and resolute. "That's all I ask. One room." The transformation began in the East Wing. Furniture was moved, rugs unrolled, shelves lined with books and puzzles. Grace painted the walls in warm colors, adding small touches that made the space feel less like an estate and more like a home within a home. Daniel and David watched curiously as she tacked drawings to the wall. "Is this for us?" Daniel asked. "It's for you," Grace said, smoothing his hair, "and for others too. Others like us," David whispered. Grace crouched beside him, her voice gentle. "Yes, sweetheart. Others who need a place to feel safe." The boys exchanged a glance, and for the first time, they nodded in solemn agreement, as if granting their permission. The first group arrived on a gray Saturday afternoon. A handful of children stepped hesitantly through the grand doors, some clutching small backpacks, others holding nothing but wary expressions. Helen greeted them with cocoa and cookies, her warmth bridging the awkward silence. Grace introduced them to Daniel and David, who shyly offered their toys. Slowly, the room began to fill with the sound of cautious voices. A board game was opened. Crayons rolled across the floor. Laughter crept in like sunlight through a window. But one girl stood apart. Clara. She was 15, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a slouch in her posture that spoke of defiance more than weariness. Her hair was streaked with a bold red, her jeans torn at the knees. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, as if daring anyone to tell her she belonged here. Grace approached carefully. "Hi, Clara," she said softly. "I'm glad you came." Clara shrugged, her gaze darting around the room. "Didn't have anywhere else to go." "That's reason enough," Grace replied, offering a small smile. Clara's eyes narrowed, as though testing her sincerity. "You really think this house of yours can fix people?" Grace shook her head. "No, but maybe it can give people a place to start." For a flicker of a moment, Clara's expression softened, then she pulled her armor back into place. "We'll see." That night, after the children had gone home, Thomas poured himself a drink in the library. Grace joined him, tired but glowing with quiet purpose. They laughed, she said, her eyes alight. For a few hours, they laughed. Thomas studied her, seeing the fire in her that refused to dim, and Clara Grace's smile faded. She's a storm waiting to break, but storms can water seeds too. He considered her words, sipping his scotch slowly. "I agreed to try this once, Grace, but I see now. You're not just trying, you're building something." She met his gaze. "We're building it." Later that night, Grace stood at the window of her small room, looking out at the frost-covered lawn. She thought of Clara's guarded eyes, of the children's tentative laughter, of Thomas's unexpected openness. She felt the weight of both fear and hope pressing against her chest. The house had once been a prison of grief. Now, perhaps, it could be a sanctuary of beginnings. And for Grace, that was worth everything. Clara didn't come back the second Saturday, or the third. When Grace asked the social worker about her absence, she only received a shrug. "She's difficult, comes when she wants, leaves when she wants. Don't take it personal." But Grace did take it personally, because she had seen that flicker the split second in Clara's eyes when she almost believed, almost allowed herself to soften. Grace knew storms. They didn't vanish overnight. They raged until someone was willing to stand in the rain. So, when Clara finally reappeared one cold afternoon, dragging her sneakers across the Harrington driveway, Grace made sure she was the one to open the door. "Thought this place was boring," Clara muttered as she stepped inside. Her red-streaked hair hid half her face, her backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder. "Sometimes boring is good," Grace replied gently. "Boring can be safe." Clara rolled her eyes. "Safe's a lie. People say that before they leave." The words hit Grace like a stone. She recognized them, if not in phrasing, then in spirit. They were words she herself could have spoken at 15, when her father coughed through the nights and her mother worked double shifts. Back then, she had believed safety was only for other people. Inside the playroom, the younger children clustered around puzzles and paints. Clara dropped her bag in the corner and leaned against the wall, watching them with a smirk that was more shield than amusement. Grace approached slowly, not wanting to crowd her. "You don't have to join in right away, but you're welcome to..." Clara snorted. "Welcome. You mean like your rich boss lets you bring strays into his mansion? Grace studied her, hearing the bite behind the words, but also the ache. This isn't about him. This is about you. Clara tilted her chin defiantly. I don't need saving. Good, Grace said softly. Because I don't save people. I stay with them. That's different. For a moment, Clara's mask slipped. Confusion flickered, then anger rose to cover it. Stay. You'll leave like everybody else. Teachers, foster homes, friends, they all leave. You will too. Grace took a slow breath, steadying herself. Maybe, I can't promise forever, but I can promise today and tomorrow. And as long as you keep walking through that door. Clara turned away, hiding her face. Grace let the silence stretch, trusting patience more than pressure. Over the next weeks, Clara tested every boundary she could. She skipped activities, mocked the other kids, refused to share during group games. She cursed under her breath, rolled her eyes, laughed at every attempt to engage her. Once, she even shoved a puzzle box off the table, scattering pieces across the floor. The room went silent. The other children froze. Grace knelt, quietly gathering the pieces without a word. Clara stood above her, smirking, daring her to scold, to explode, to prove she was just another adult waiting to break. But Grace only looked up, her voice calm. You knocked it down. You can help put it back. Clara blinked, startled by the lack of punishment. For a heartbeat, the storm faltered. Then, muttering under her breath, she crouched and helped shove the pieces back into the box. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in the armor. One evening, when the children had gone home and the twins were asleep, Grace sat by the fire in the sitting room. Thomas entered quietly, pouring tea instead of his usual scotch. He sat across from her, studying her tired expression. Clara, he guessed. Grace nodded, rubbing her temples. She fights everything: trust, kindness, even herself. And yet, I see her. I see myself in her. Thomas leaned forward, curiosity softening his sternness. How so? Grace hesitated, then said, When I was her age, I believed love was temporary, that everyone leaves. I built walls so no one could prove me right, but walls don't stop pain, they just keep comfort out. Clara's living in that same prison. Thomas studied her quietly. And you're determined to tear down her walls. Grace shook her head. Not tear down, just wait by the door until she lets me in. The breakthrough came on a rainy afternoon. Clara had come late, drenched and shivering, her jacket thin against the cold. Grace found her in the east wing, staring at the shelves of books. You like to read? Grace asked softly. Clara shrugged, dripping water on the rug. Sometimes. Depends. Grace pulled down a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, its spine cracked from years of use. This was my favorite at your age. Want to borrow it? Clara eyed the book suspiciously. Why? So, I'll sit quietly and stop being a problem. No, Grace said simply. Because books kept me company when I thought no one else would. Maybe this one will do the same for you. For a long moment, Clara didn't move. Then, slowly, she reached out and took the book. Her fingers brushed Grace's, quick but telling. She muttered, Don't expect me to say thank you. Grace smiled faintly. I just expect you to come back and tell me what you thought. That night, Grace sat alone, staring at the rain streaking the windows. She thought of Clara's guarded eyes, of her own reflection in that stormy spirit. Healing would not come fast. It would not come easy. But she had learned one truth in her own life. Even the fiercest storms can water the seeds of hope. And Grace was willing to wait, to stand steady, until Clara's storm passed. It began with whispers. A headline buried in the corner of a local paper, Who is the Woman? Inside the Harrington estate. Grace didn't see it at first. Helen hid the paper in the pantry, hoping it would die quickly. But scandals rarely die quietly, especially when wealth and grief are involved. Within a week, The whispers grew louder. Articles appeared in glossy magazines, painting Grace as a mystery woman with no credentials, no pedigree, no past worth trusting. Nanny or opportunist, one article asked, alongside a grainy photo of her stepping out of a grocery store, Daniel holding her hand. Another headline sneered, Widower's new companion, comfort or conspiracy. Grace sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread before her, her stomach twisting. She had given her life to children who were not her own, endured sleepless nights and silent battles, only to be reduced to a caricature of greed. The boys noticed her silence. "Why are you sad?" Gracie David asked, tugging at her sleeve. She forced a smile, folding the papers quickly. "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart. Just silly stories." But inside, the sting was sharp. Thomas reacted differently. He stormed into his office with a stack of newspapers under his arm, slamming them onto the desk. "They're vultures," he growled, picking at whatever they can to sell copies. Grace followed, her voice low. "It's not just gossip, Thomas. They're shaping a story the boys will grow up to read." His jaw clenched. "Then I'll crush it. I'll call in lawyers, shut them down." But even as he spoke, doubt flickered in his eyes. Grace saw it, the shadow that crept in when words like unqualified and inappropriate echoed too loudly. And then came the letter. It arrived without a return address, the envelope plain, the handwriting sharp. Thomas opened it at his desk, Grace standing nearby. He read it once, then again, his face paling. "She is not who you think." 7 words, no signature, no explanation, only poison designed to fester. He folded the letter slowly, his fingers trembling. Grace's heart sank as she watched the shift in his expression. Not anger, not even disbelief, but hesitation. "Thomas," she whispered, "you don't believe this, do you?" He looked at her, his eyes clouded. I don't know." The words cut deeper than the letter. Grace staggered back a step, her chest tightening. "After everything, after what we've been through, you still doubt me. It's not you." "I doubt," he said quickly, almost pleading. "It's myself, my judgment. I let you in without knowing anything about you, your past, your family, why you left your teaching job. Maybe I've been blind." Grace's throat burned. She wanted to shout, to remind him of nights spent rocking his sons to sleep, of battles fought in court, of Clara slowly softening under her care, but all she managed was a whisper. "Blind." Her voice shook, or just unwilling to trust anyone but yourself. That night, the house felt colder than it had in months. Grace tucked the boys into bed, reading the story with a steady voice, even as tears threatened. When Daniel reached up to hug her, she lingered, burying her face in his hair, drawing strength from the warmth of his small body. Downstairs, Thomas sat in the study with the letter on the desk before him. The fire crackled, casting shadows across his face. He poured a glass of scotch, but didn't drink, only stared into the amber liquid as if it held answers. He remembered Grace's words on the stand. Family is the hand that doesn't let go when you're afraid. And yet, here he was, loosening his grip, letting doubt seep in. Helen entered quietly, her eyes falling on the letter. She picked it up, read the words, and set it down with a sharp shake of her head. "Cowards write lies without signing their names," she said firmly, "but cowards can still destroy if you let them." Thomas rubbed his temples. "What if they're right? What if I've built this fragile piece on someone I don't truly know?" Helen's voice softened. "Then ask her. Don't punish her with your silence. She deserves more than that." Later, Grace stood by her window, staring at the moonlight spilling across the lawn. Her chest ached with betrayal, not from the press, not from strangers, but from Thomas's hesitation. She had carried her past quietly, not because she was ashamed, but because wounds are not always meant for display. Yet now those same silences were being twisted into weapons. Her hand brushed against the drawer of her nightstand, where an old photograph lay hidden, her younger self, holding a newborn. The baby's features blurred, the joy short-lived, her greatest loss, tucked away in private grief. She wondered, not for the first time, if silence had been her mistake. The next morning, Grace carried on as usual, preparing breakfast, braiding Daniel's hair, coaxing David to eat his eggs. But her smile was thin, her eyes shadowed. The boys felt it, though they didn't understand. As she cleared the dishes, Thomas entered the kitchen. Their eyes met across the room. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, the weight of unasked questions between them. Grace broke the silence first. "If you want to know who I am, Thomas, ask me. Don't let strangers answer for you." Her voice was steady, but inside, her heart trembled, because she knew trust was not something that could be demanded. It had to be chosen, and right now, his choice was uncertain. The east wing of the Harrington estate no longer echoed with silence. Each Saturday, children arrived with backpacks and guarded faces, filling the once empty rooms with hesitant voices and laughter that grew louder week by week. Grace watched them carefully, seeing how each one carried shadows too heavy for shoulders so young. One evening, as she walked through the converted playroom, she noticed the walls. They were bright with paint, yes, but still bare of meaning. An idea stirred in her. That night, she gathered Thomas and Helen in the study. The fire crackled as she spoke. "These children carry scars some you can see, most you cannot. They need a way to show that scars don't mean weakness. They mean survival." Thomas leaned back, listening intently. "What are you suggesting?" "A hall of scars," Grace said softly. "A room where they can leave pieces of themselves, drawings, poems, objects that tell their stories. Not to dwell in pain, but to show they endured, to make healing visible." Helen's eyes glistened, like a gallery of courage. Thomas hesitated, as he often did when Grace's ideas carried risk. "And if it reopens wounds, then we teach them that wounds can close," Grace replied firmly. "That sharing doesn't make them weaker. It makes them less alone." After a long pause, Thomas nodded. "Do it." The following week, the children arrived with curiosity buzzing in their eyes. Grace explained the idea gently, sitting cross-legged among them. "This room will be ours. You can draw something, write something, or bring something that reminds you of what you've survived. It doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be big. Just real." At first, they hesitated. Then, slowly, small hands began to move. 8-year-old Lily painted a house split down the middle, with herself standing bravely in the gap. 10-year-old Marcus taped up a photo of his dog, lost when his family split. Daniel and David worked together on a drawing of 2 boys holding hands in the dark, a light glowing faintly ahead. Grace watched them with pride swelling in her chest. They were learning to speak without words, to let their scars breathe. And then there was Clara. She stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed, eyes darting between the wall and the floor. Her backpack lay unopened at her feet. "You don't have to," Grace said quietly, approaching her. "Not until you're ready." Clara scoffed, but her voice cracked. "What's the point? Nobody wants to see my mess." Grace's voice softened. "This isn't about what others want to see. It's about what you need to release." Clara turned away, but Grace caught a flicker of longing in her expression. 2 weeks later, Clara returned with her backpack heavier than usual. She didn't join the group at first, just lingered near the window. Finally, when the room quieted, she pulled something out, a worn denim jacket, the fabric frayed at the sleeves. The children watched as she walked toward the wall. Her movements were stiff, almost angry, but her hands trembled. "This was my mom's," she muttered, pinning it up with shaking fingers. "She gave it to me before she left." The room fell still. Clara swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the jacket. "She said it would keep me warm, but it didn't." "Nothing did?" "She never came back. I wore it every day until I couldn't stand the smell anymore. It still smelled like her." Her voice broke, and then it didn't. Tears streaked her cheeks, raw and unguarded. For the first time, the storm inside her spilled into the open. The other children didn't mock or stare. Lily stepped forward, slipping her small hand into Clara's. David, braver than usual, whispered, "It's okay. We know." Clara's defenses shattered. She sank to the floor, covering her face, and Grace knelt beside her, wrapping her in steady arms. She didn't hush her, didn't rush her. She simply stayed, letting Clara's sobs echo in the hall that had once known only silence. That night, after the children left, Thomas and Grace stood together in the Hall of Scars. The jacket still hung on the wall, fragile but powerful, surrounded by drawings and poems. "She's braver than she knows," Thomas said quietly. Grace nodded. "They all are. Scars don't disappear." "Thomas, but when you put them on a wall, they stop being shame. They become proof of survival." He looked at her, admiration softening the sharp lines of his face. "And you, Grace, you've given them a place to put down what they've carried too long." She lowered her gaze, humbled. "No, they gave that to each other. I just opened the door." Weeks later, the Hall of Scars had transformed. Where once the walls were bare, now they were alive with stories, crayon drawings beside poems, photographs beside broken toys that once carried meaning. Each piece whispered, "I hurt, but I'm still here." And in the center of it all, Clara's jacket remained, a symbol not of abandonment, but of resilience. Grace often caught Clara standing in front of it, shoulders straighter, eyes clearer. The storm in her was far from gone, but for the first time, it had a place to rest. The storm outside had finally broken. For weeks, rumors in town and whispers in papers had circled like vultures, suggesting Grace was unfit, unqualified, even manipulative. But Thomas Harrington had grown weary of silence. One evening, he called a press gathering in the grand but modestly lit hall of the community wing. Grace tried to stop him, fearing exposure would only add fuel. But Thomas stood firm. When the questions began, sharp and accusatory, Thomas's voice carried with unusual calm. "You want to know who Grace Ellison is?" He said, gaze steady on the cluster of reporters. "She is the woman who stayed when no one else could. 14 nannies walked away. Therapists gave up. Doctors prescribed pills that never touched the nightmares my sons carried. But Grace made them laugh again. She made them sleep again. And she made me remember what it means to be a father." A hush spread across the room. He leaned closer to the microphones. "So, if you want to question her, question me, because I choose to stand with her." Grace, standing at the side, felt her breath hitch. The words weren't dramatic, but they were irrevocable. For the first time, Thomas wasn't hiding behind his wealth or reputation. He was exposing himself, raw, because he believed in her. That night, the twins padded into the library in their pajamas. Daniel clutched his stuffed bear. David rubbed his eyes. Daddy Daniel asked, voice small, voice. "Is Miss Grace really staying?" Thomas glanced at Grace, then crouched down beside his sons. "She's not Miss Grace anymore. She's family." David tilted his head. "Like, Mom." Grace froze, heart thudding in her chest. She opened her mouth to gently deflect, but Daniel spoke first. "You tuck us in. You make us pancakes. You stay. Moms stay." The innocence of their words pierced through the defenses she had built. She smiled weakly, brushing a curl from Daniel's forehead. "I'll stay," she whispered, "as long as you'll have me." David leaned against her shoulder, murmuring sleepily, "Good, because we already picked you." Grace held them both, swallowing the lump in her throat. The word mom still felt foreign, too heavy with memories of what she had lost. Yet, in that moment, it also felt like home. Later, when the house grew quiet, Grace sat alone in her small room, the lamp casting a soft pool of light over her desk. The twins' words replayed in her mind, mingling with the echo of Thomas's public declaration. She opened her journal, pen trembling in her hand. What if I let them love me, and I lose them too? What if their trust becomes another ghost I carry? I am strong enough to stand beside them. But am I strong enough to let them call me Mother? Tears blurred the ink. She pressed the page closed, unable to write further. A soft knock sounded. Thomas entered, his presence quieter than usual. He didn't speak right away, just sat across from her, his eyes searching hers. I know what they said tonight, he began gently. I saw what it did to you. Grace lowered her gaze. They don't understand. To them, love is simple. To me, it's cost everything. Thomas leaned forward, his voice low but resolute. Grace, you don't have to replace anyone. You just have to be who you already are to them. The one who stayed. Her chest ached. And if I fail, if I can't keep them safe, then we fail together, he said firmly, because I won't let you carry it alone. His words hung in the air like a promise, fragile, terrifying, but true. The next morning, Grace woke to the sound of laughter outside. She pulled on a sweater and stepped into the backyard. Daniel and David were chasing each other across the grass, their shoes damp with dew. Thomas stood nearby, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to her without a word. Together, they watched the boys run, stumble, and rise again. For the first time in years, Grace allowed herself to breathe fully. She realized that maybe, just maybe, choosing to stay didn't mean waiting for the storm. It meant planting roots deep enough to survive it. The Harrington estate had changed in ways no architect could have predicted. Once a fortress of silence and grief, it now pulsed with voices, footsteps, and the echo of children who had found somewhere to belong. On Saturday mornings, the East Wing no longer stood empty. It buzzed with activity tables covered in crayons and paintbrushes, laughter rising from storytelling circles, the shuffle of sneakers as children chased each other across the courtyard. The sanctuary wing, as Helen fondly called it, had become a living place of healing. Grace moved through the rooms quietly, not as a guest or even as a caretaker, but as someone woven into the very fabric of the home. Each child she passed greeted her with a nod, a smile, or sometimes just the soft relief of knowing she was there. That spring afternoon, she stepped outside to find Thomas waiting beneath the great oak. His hands were dusty, his sleeves rolled, a small spade resting at his feet. By his side, Daniel and David stood proudly beside a young sapling they had helped plant. We thought it was time, Thomas said, gesturing to the fragile tree. Its roots were shallow still, but the soil was rich. A tree that grows because we tended it together. Grace knelt to adjust the soil around its base, her hands gentle but firm. The twins hovered nearby, patting dirt clumsily with their small palms. Daniel beamed. This one's ours. It'll grow like us, David added with quiet certainty. And it won't ever leave. Grace's throat tightened. She reached out, steadying the thin trunk as the breeze bent it slightly. Every tree needs roots, she said softly. But it also needs wings branches that stretch out and touch the sky. Thomas's gaze lingered on her, his voice low but sure. That's what you've given us, Grace. Roots and wings. As dusk settled, lanterns glowed across the garden, their light mingling with the stars. The Hall of Scars inside was now complete, its walls shimmering with bravery. Children who once hid their stories now brought friends to see them, proud instead of ashamed. Even Clara, still fiery, still guarded, had begun to mentor the younger ones, her denim jacket a quiet banner of resilience. Helen often remarked that the estate felt alive again, not with grandeur, but with grace. And though Thomas rarely spoke of it, he knew in his bones that the shift had begun the moment one woman chose not to walk away. That evening, they gathered for dinner in the long dining room. No staff served, no phones buzzed, no silence pressed. Instead, the table overflowed with food they had cooked together: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, warm bread, bowls of strawberries. The twins argued over whose turn it was to say grace. Clara rolled her eyes, then surprised everyone by volunteering to read a poem she had written for the Hall of Scars. Helen laughed so hard at one of David's jokes that she spilled water down her blouse. And through it all, Thomas and Grace sat side by side, shoulders nearly touching, sharing small glances that spoke more than words. When the laughter swelled, Grace leaned back, letting the sound wash over her. She thought of the girl she once was, the one abandoned, the one who lost, the one who feared she was too broken to belong. And then she looked at the faces around the table. Family, not by blood, not by contract, but by the simple, extraordinary choice to stay. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and the children tucked in, Grace and Thomas returned to the sapling in the garden. The moon cast silver light over its tender branches. Grace brushed soil from her hands and whispered, "It still feels fragile." Thomas stepped closer. "So do we. But fragile things can grow strong when tended." He reached for her hand, not in hesitation, but with quiet conviction. She didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, steady as the roots beneath their feet. For the first time in years, Grace allowed herself to imagine a tomorrow without fear. A tomorrow filled not with ghosts of what was lost, but with the laughter of those who remained. The wind rustled softly through the sapling's leaves, carrying with it the echo of children's voices, the warmth of shared meals, and the unspoken vow that healing would not be temporary here. It would be inherited, at its heart. This story is not just about a wealthy man, a determined woman, or two children learning to smile again. It is about the quiet truth that families are not always written in blood. They are built in the everyday choice to stay. Grace showed us that credentials and appearances mean little compared to patience, compassion, and the courage to keep showing up when storms rage. Thomas revealed that pride and wealth cannot mend what only humility and presence can heal. And the children taught us something even deeper. Trust is fragile, but when nurtured, it grows into something stronger than fear. For many of us in later seasons of life, this lesson strikes close to home. We carry our own scars, our own regrets. Yet, healing is still possible, not in grand gestures, but in daily acts of love, a phone call, a shared meal, a hand held in silence. So, let us remember the true measure of family is not who shares our name, but who chooses to walk beside us when the night is darkest. In staying, we give roots. In loving, we give wings. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with us through this journey of love, loss, and healing. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who may need its message, and subscribe to Shining Stories for more tales that inspire the soul. Your support helps us keep bringing light into the darkness, one story at a time.